Marcus Wellington stood in his glass-walled office on the 45th floor, staring at two report cards that made his stomach turn. The numbers were printed in red ink like wounds on white paper. Another semester, another disaster. His twin sons, Ethan and Evan, had failed mathematics again. Not just failed with low scores, but truly catastrophic numbers that suggested they hadn't understood a single concept all year. The boys were 12 years old now, and this pattern had been repeating since 3rd grade. Marcus had tried everything money could buy. Private tutors from elite universities came to the mansion 3 times a week, armed with expensive materials and proven methods. He had purchased every educational software program on the market. The boys had attended summer math camps at prestigious institutions. Nothing worked. The tutors would leave frustrated, talking about attention problems and learning disabilities. Some suggested medication, others recommended special schools. Marcus refused to believe his sons were incapable. He had built a tech empire from nothing, turning a small software company into a billion-dollar corporation. Intelligence ran in his family. His late wife, Caroline, had been a brilliant architect before the car accident took her 5 years ago. The boys had to have inherited something from both of them. Yet here they were, unable to grasp basic algebra while their classmates moved forward. The expensive private school they attended had been patient, but Marcus could sense their tolerance wearing thin. The headmaster had called him in twice this semester already. There were whispers about holding the boys back a year, about whether they belonged at such an academically rigorous institution. The thought of his sons being labeled as failures made Marcus's jaw clench. He had worked too hard to build his family's reputation to watch it crumble because of report cards. At home, the tension was thick enough to cut. Ethan and Evan knew they had disappointed their father again. They sat at the dinner table in silence, pushing food around their plates while Marcus read through their math exams. The mistakes were painful to see. Simple multiplication errors, fractions that made no sense, word problems left completely blank. Marcus wanted to shout at them, to demand they explain how they could be so careless. But when he looked at their faces, he saw fear and shame instead of defiance. These weren't boys who didn't care. They were boys who had tried and failed so many times that they had stopped believing they could succeed. That realization hurt worse than the failing grades. The house felt emptier than usual that night. It was a massive estate with 12 bedrooms, a pool, tennis courts, and gardens that required a full staff to maintain. But without Caroline, it had never felt like a home. It felt like a museum where they all existed in separate wings, crossing paths only at meals. Marcus spent most of his time at the office. The boys spent their time in their rooms, gaming or watching videos. Communication had broken down somewhere along the way. The only person who seemed to truly connect with Ethan and Evan was Rosa Martinez, the housekeeper who had been with the family for 3 years. She was a quiet woman in her 50s, originally from Guatemala, who took care of the house with a gentle efficiency that Marcus appreciated. She never bothered him with unnecessary questions or complaints. She simply did her work and did it well. Marcus had noticed that the boys seemed calmer when Rosa was around. They would actually smile and talk to her while they barely spoke to him. At first, this had annoyed him. Why would his sons open up to the maid but not their own father? But lately he had been too exhausted to feel jealous. If Rosa could reach them when he couldn't, maybe that was for the best. What Marcus didn't know was that Rosa had been observing the math situation for months. She had seen the tutors come and go. She had heard the boys crying in their rooms after particularly bad sessions. She had watched Marcus's frustration grow with each failed test, and she had kept quiet, not because she had nothing to say, but because no one had asked for her opinion. Who would ask a housekeeper about mathematics? But Rosa had a secret that no one in the Wellington household knew. Before coming to America, she had been a teacher in Guatemala City. Not just any teacher, but an award-winning mathematics instructor who had helped hundreds of struggling students discover that they weren't stupid. They just learned differently. She had developed her own methods over 20 years of teaching, methods that reached children whom the traditional system had left behind. She had stopped teaching when her husband died, and family circumstances forced her to emigrate for better opportunities. Housekeeping paid better in America than teaching had paid in Guatemala, and she had sent most of her earnings back home to support her elderly mother and her sister's children. It was honest work, and she never complained. But some nights, after cleaning the kitchen, she would stand in the hallway and hear Ethan and Evan struggling with their homework, and her heart would ache with the need to help. Rosa had almost spoken up a dozen times. When she heard a tutor explaining fractions in a way that was clearly confusing the boys, she had bitten her tongue. When she saw Evan crying over a geometry problem, she had wanted to sit down and show him the simple way to visualize it. But she had always held back. This wasn't her place. These weren't her students. She was just the housekeeper. Then one Thursday afternoon, everything changed. Marcus had left for an overseas business trip. The current tutor had canceled at the last minute due to illness. The boys were supposed to be studying for a major test the next day. But when Rosa came to collect the dinner dishes, she found them in the dining room surrounded by papers, looking absolutely defeated. Ethan had his head down on the table. Evan was staring at his textbook with tears running down his face. Neither of them noticed Rosa standing in the doorway at first. She watched Evan try to solve an equation, erasing and rewriting the same problem over and over, getting more frustrated with each attempt. Something inside Rosa finally broke. She couldn't watch these children suffer anymore when she knew she could help. Setting down her cleaning supplies, she walked over to the table. Her voice was soft but clear. She asked if they wanted her to explain it in a different way. The boys looked up, surprised. They had never heard Rosa speak much English beyond basic household communication. They certainly had never imagined she knew anything about mathematics. But there was something in her eyes, a confidence and kindness that made Evan nod slowly. Rosa pulled out a chair and sat down. She picked up Evan's pencil and looked at the problem he was struggling with. It was a basic algebraic equation, the kind that the boys had failed to understand for months despite expensive tutoring. She smiled and told them she was going to show them something their tutors probably never mentioned. She was going to show them why math was actually easy, once someone explained it the right way. What Rosa did next would change everything in the Wellington household. She didn't use fancy terminology or complicated formulas. She didn't treat the boys like they were slow or broken. Instead, she started with a simple question. "Do you like pizza?" Ethan and Evan stared at Rosa, completely confused. They were expecting another lecture about variables and coefficients. Instead, she was asking about pizza. Evan wiped his tears and nodded hesitantly. Of course they liked pizza. What kid didn't? Rosa smiled and pulled a blank piece of paper toward her. She drew a circle and divided it into 8 slices. She explained that math wasn't about memorizing rules that made no sense. Math was about understanding how things worked in real life. If they could cut a pizza, they could understand fractions. If they could count their money, they could understand algebra. The textbooks made everything complicated, but life made it simple. She pointed at the equation Evan had been struggling with. It looked like a foreign language to the boys, full of X's and numbers and symbols. Rosa told them to forget about the X for a moment. She asked Evan to imagine he had some cookies, but he didn't know exactly how many. Someone gave him 3 more cookies. Now he had 8 cookies total. How many did he start with? Evan thought about it for a second and answered 5. Rosa smiled wide and told him that he had just solved an algebra problem. That was all the equation was asking. The X was just the number of cookies he started with. His eyes went wide. That was it? That was what his tutor had been trying to explain for 3 weeks? Rosa nodded and explained that math tutors often forgot that they had to build a bridge between numbers on paper and real things in the world. The boys weren't dumb. They just needed someone to translate the language of mathematics into something they could see and touch and understand. She told them that every single math problem was really just a story problem if they knew how to read it right. For the next 2 hours, Rosa worked with both boys. She didn't just show them how to solve problems. She showed them why the solutions worked. She used money, food, games, sports, everything the boys cared about to explain concepts that had seemed impossible before. When they worked on multiplication, she talked about video game scores. When they worked on percentages, she talked about basketball shooting averages. When they worked on geometry, she folded paper and made shapes they could hold in their hands. The most amazing thing happened. The boys stopped looking frustrated and started looking curious. They began asking questions, real questions, not just repeating what they thought they should say. When they got an answer right, Rosa celebrated like they had won a championship. When they got an answer wrong, she didn't make them feel stupid. She just showed them where they took a wrong turn and helped them find their way back. By the time Rosa had to leave that evening, both Ethan and Evan had completed their homework. More than that, they actually understood what they had done. For the first time in years, they felt like maybe they weren't hopeless at math after all. Maybe they just needed someone who spoke their language. Before Rosa left, Evan grabbed her hand. His voice was small when he asked if she could help them again. He had a big test tomorrow, and he was terrified. All the other tests had been disasters, and he didn't want to fail again. Rosa looked at both boys and saw something she recognized from her years of teaching. She saw students who had been beaten down by a system that didn't know how to reach them. She saw the same look she had seen in Guatemala on children who thought they were stupid, because no one had taken the time to teach them properly. Rosa made a decision. She told the boys she would come early the next morning before school. She would bring breakfast and they would review together. It would be their secret for now. She didn't want to cause problems or overstep her boundaries, but she couldn't walk away when she knew she could help. That night, Rosa barely slept. She was breaking so many unspoken rules. Housekeepers didn't tutor their employers' children. She wasn't being paid for this. If Marcus found out, he might think she was trying to take advantage or position herself inappropriately. But something stronger than fear was driving her. It was the same thing that had made her become a teacher in the first place. She couldn't stand by and watch children suffer when she had the knowledge to help them. The next morning, Rosa arrived at the mansion an hour before sunrise. She had stopped at a bakery and bought fresh pastries with her own money. She had prepared note cards with simple tips and tricks she had developed over her years of teaching. When Ethan and Evan came down to the kitchen, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, they found Rosa at the table with hot chocolate and a warm smile. They reviewed for 90 minutes before school. Rosa didn't try to cram new information into their heads. Instead, she built their confidence. She reminded them of what they had learned the night before. She gave them simple tricks to remember formulas. She taught them how to check their work and how to stay calm if they got stuck. Most importantly, she told them to believe in themselves. They were smart enough. They were capable. They just needed to trust what they knew. When the school car came to pick up the boys, they hugged Rosa. It was an impulsive gesture that surprised all three of them. The boys had never hugged their housekeepers before. But Rosa felt like more than a housekeeper now. She felt like an ally, like someone who was on their side. The math test was fourth period right after lunch. Ethan sat at his desk feeling his heart pound. He looked at the first problem and felt the familiar panic rising. It was an equation that looked complicated and scary. His hands started to sweat. He almost left it blank like he usually did. Then he remembered what Rosa had said. Every problem was just a story. What was this problem really asking? He read it again slowly this time. He imagined it as a video game. Points earned plus bonus equals total score. What were the points earned? Suddenly he saw it. The X wasn't scary. It was just the missing piece of information. He wrote down the steps Rosa had showed him, and the answer appeared like magic. Across the room, Evan was having a similar experience. A geometry problem about triangles had him stumped at first. Then he remembered Rosa folding the paper napkin at breakfast, showing them how angles worked. He could see it in his mind. His pencil moved across the paper with more confidence than he had felt in years. Neither boy finished the entire test, and they both made some mistakes. But for the first time ever, they didn't leave half the page blank. They tried every problem. They showed their work. They used the methods Rosa had taught them. When they handed in their papers, they felt something unfamiliar. It wasn't confidence exactly, but it wasn't complete despair either. It was hope. Marcus returned from his business trip 3 days later. He was exhausted from travel and immediately buried himself in work. He barely noticed that his sons seemed different. They were quieter than usual at dinner, but he assumed they were dreading another conversation about their grades. He decided to wait until the test results came back before addressing the math situation again. He wasn't looking forward to it. A week passed before the graded tests came home. Marcus was in his home office when both boys appeared at his door, holding envelopes. His stomach dropped. Here we go again, he thought. Another failure. Another disappointment. He told them to come in and braced himself for what he was about to see. Ethan handed over his test first. Marcus opened it slowly, expecting the worst. His eyes scanned the page and stopped. 68%. It wasn't a perfect score, but it wasn't failure either. It was a D+, maybe a C-, depending on the grading scale. Marcus looked up at Ethan in shock. His son was smiling nervously. Then Evan handed over his test. 72%. A solid C. Marcus couldn't speak for a moment. These were the highest math grades his sons had received in 4 years. Something had changed. He demanded to know what had happened. Had they cheated? Had someone given them the answers? The boys shook their heads quickly. They had studied, but this time it actually worked. They actually understood the material. Marcus pressed his sons for details. Who had helped them study? The tutor had been sick that week. The boys exchanged glances, and Marcus could see they were holding something back. He told them he needed to know the truth. If someone had found a way to reach them when expensive tutors couldn't, he wanted to know who it was. Finally, Evan spoke up. He told his father that Rosa had helped them. Rosa, the housekeeper. She had shown them a different way to understand math, and it had actually made sense. They had spent just a few hours with her, and it had done more than months of professional tutoring. Marcus was speechless. The maid? The quiet woman who cleaned their house and prepared their meals knew how to teach mathematics? It seemed impossible. He wondered if the boys were making this up as an excuse, but their faces were completely sincere. They weren't joking or trying to trick him. They genuinely believed that Rosa had helped them. That evening, Marcus asked Rosa to come to his office before she left for the day. She appeared in the doorway looking nervous, her hands folded in front of her. She probably thought she was being fired. Marcus gestured for her to sit down, which only seemed to make her more anxious. Housekeepers usually didn't sit in the master's office. Marcus got straight to the point. His sons claimed that she had tutored them in mathematics. Was this true? Rosa nodded slowly, her eyes on the floor. She apologized immediately. She knew it wasn't her place, but she had seen the boys struggling and couldn't help herself. She promised it wouldn't happen again. She hoped he wouldn't be angry. Marcus held up his hand to stop her. He wasn't angry. He was confused and curious. He wanted to know how she knew mathematics well enough to tutor his children when professional educators with advanced degrees had failed. What was her background? Rosa hesitated, then began to speak. Her English was more fluent than Marcus had realized. She usually kept quiet because she was shy, not because she couldn't communicate. She explained that she had been a mathematics teacher in Guatemala for 20 years. She had specialized in helping students who struggled with traditional teaching methods. She had developed her own approach that focused on practical applications and building confidence, rather than memorizing formulas. She told him about the awards she had won, the students she had helped graduate, the children who had gone from failing to excelling under her guidance. Teaching had been her passion and her gift, but life had taken her in a different direction. When her husband passed away and her family needed money, she had come to America where housekeeping paid more than teaching had paid back home. Marcus listened to all of this with growing amazement. Here was a master teacher working in his home, and he had been treating her as invisible. He had paid thousands of dollars to tutors while the person who could actually help his sons was scrubbing his floors. The irony was almost painful. He asked Rosa if she would be willing to continue working with the boys. He would pay her, of course, as a tutor in addition to her housekeeping duties. Whatever rate she thought was fair. Rosa looked shocked. She had expected to be reprimanded for overstepping, not offered a promotion. She told Marcus that money wasn't necessary. The boys needed help and she could provide it. That was enough. But Marcus insisted. If she was going to save his sons from academic failure, she deserved to be compensated properly. They negotiated briefly and settled on an arrangement that would significantly increase her income, while still allowing her to maintain the house. Over the next weeks, Rosa became Ethan and Evan's regular tutor. She worked with them every day. After school for 2 hours, Marcus was amazed at the transformation. The boys actually looked forward to their tutoring sessions. They laughed while they learned. They asked questions without fear of being made to feel stupid. They completed homework that had been impossible before, but it wasn't just about techniques and tricks. Rosa was teaching them something deeper. She was teaching them that they were capable of understanding difficult concepts. She was showing them that their previous failures weren't because they were dumb, but because no one had taught them in a way their brains could process. She was rebuilding their confidence piece by piece. Marcus started paying more attention to what was happening in his own home. He would sometimes stand outside the dining room while Rosa tutored, listening to her patient explanations and the boys' excited responses. He heard her praise them for small victories. He heard her gently correct mistakes without judgment. He realized that Rosa wasn't just teaching math. She was teaching his sons how to think, how to persist, how to believe in themselves. One afternoon, Marcus finally asked Rosa about her teaching philosophy. What made her approach different from all the expensive tutors he had hired? Rosa thought for a moment before answering. She said that most tutors tried to pour knowledge into students like filling an empty bucket. They assumed that if they just explained clearly enough, the students would absorb the information. But children weren't empty buckets, Rosa explained. They were human beings with different ways of understanding the world. Some children thought in pictures, some thought in stories, some needed to move their bodies to understand concepts. Traditional teaching often ignored these differences and insisted everyone learn the same way. When students couldn't adapt to the system labeled them as failures. Rosa's approach was to meet each child where they were. She observed how they naturally thought and processed information, then translated mathematics into their language. For Ethan, who loved video games, she used gaming analogies. For Evan, who was artistic, she used visual representations and drew everything. She made math relevant to their lives rather than some abstract torture they had to endure. Marcus realized he had been making the same mistake with his sons that he made in his business. He had assumed that the most expensive solution was the best solution. He had hired prestigious tutors from elite schools without considering whether they could actually connect with his children. He had treated education like a product he could purchase rather than a relationship that had to be built. The next progress reports came home 6 weeks after Rosa started tutoring. Both boys had improved dramatically. Ethan was now maintaining a solid C, and Evan had climbed to a B-. Their math teacher sent a note saying she was impressed by their progress and wanted to know what had changed. The headmaster called Marcus personally to congratulate him on finding whatever intervention was working. Marcus felt proud, but also deeply humbled. The solution to his son's problems had been in his house the whole time, wearing an apron and cleaning bathrooms. He had been so blinded by class and credentials that he had almost missed it entirely. How many other things was he missing because he only looked in expected places? The relationship between Marcus and Rosa began to shift. He started seeing her as a colleague rather than just hired help. He asked her opinion on matters related to the boys. He consulted with her about their emotional development, their social challenges, their fears and dreams. Rosa knew his sons better than he did, and that was a painful truth to accept. Rosa, for her part, began to feel more comfortable in the household. She spoke up more often. She offered suggestions about the boys' schedules, their diet, their need for more time outdoors and less time on screens. Marcus listened and implemented many of her ideas. Slowly, the mansion began to feel less like a museum and more like a home where people actually cared about each other. But not everyone was happy about these changes. Some of Marcus's business associates raised eyebrows when they learned that his housekeeper was tutoring his children. They suggested it was inappropriate. They warned him that he was blurring important boundaries. One friend even implied that Rosa might be taking advantage of the situation, positioning herself for something more than employment. These comments bothered Marcus more than he wanted to admit. Not because he believed them, but because he recognized the prejudice behind them. Rosa had proven herself to be exactly what his family needed. She was educated, skilled, and genuinely cared about his sons. But because she cleaned houses for a living and came from Guatemala, some people automatically assumed she must have ulterior motives or insufficient qualifications. Marcus found himself defending Rosa and questioning relationships he had maintained for years. He started to see how many of his wealthy friends viewed service workers as invisible or interchangeable. They tipped poorly at restaurants and spoke rudely to retail workers. They hired nannies and housekeepers but never learned their full names or anything about their lives. The same callousness Marcus had exhibited for years. The semester continued and Ethan and Evan kept improving. They weren't suddenly becoming math geniuses, but they were becoming competent students who could keep up with their class. More importantly, they had stopped hating mathematics. They still didn't love it the way Rosa did, but they no longer saw it as an impossible enemy. They saw it as a challenge they could overcome with effort and the right guidance. Rosa's influence expanded beyond just mathematics. The boys started doing better in their other subjects, too. The confidence they gained from succeeding in math spilled over into everything else. They participated more in class discussions. They turned in assignments on time. Their teachers reported that they seemed happier and more engaged with school in general. At home, the atmosphere was lighter. There were fewer tense dinners and angry confrontations about homework. Marcus actually started coming home earlier from work because he wanted to see his sons, not because he had to discipline them. He would sit with them during tutoring sessions sometimes, not to supervise but to learn. Rosa's teaching methods fascinated him. He found himself wishing he had learned math this way when he was young. One evening, Marcus asked Rosa why she had never mentioned her teaching background when she first applied for the housekeeping position. Rosa explained that she had included it on her resume, but the employment agency had told her to remove it. They said American families wanted housekeepers who focused on housekeeping, not employees who might seem overqualified or have other ambitions. She had needed the job desperately, so she had followed their advice and kept her past hidden. The conversation left Marcus feeling guilty. How many talented people were trapped in jobs below their capabilities because of circumstances or prejudice? How many Rosas were out there, cleaning offices or washing dishes when they could be teaching or healing or creating? The world was wasting so much human potential, and he had been part of that waste. Marcus made a decision. He wanted to help Rosa return to teaching if that was what she wanted. He could provide references, connect her with private schools in the area, even help her get her teaching credentials certified in the United States if necessary. Rosa was touched by the offer, but told him she was content for now. She was helping Ethan and Evan, which fulfilled her need to teach. She was earning enough to support her family. She was finally feeling valued for her mind, not just her hands. That was enough. The boys' end-of-semester exams arrived in December. This was the big test, the one that would determine whether their improvement was real or just temporary. Marcus tried not to show how nervous he was. The boys had worked so hard and Rosa had invested so much time and energy. He desperately wanted them to succeed, not for himself but for them. Ethan and Evan spent the week before exams reviewing with Rosa every evening. She didn't cram new information into their heads. Instead, she reviewed the foundations they had built over the past months. She reminded them of the strategies that worked for each of them personally. She made them practice staying calm and reading questions carefully. She told them stories about students she had taught in Guatemala, who had overcome similar challenges and gone on to do amazing things. The night before the math exam, Rosa made a special dinner for the boys. She cooked traditional Guatemalan food, explaining to Marcus that where she came from, families ate together before important events to share strength. Marcus joined them, and for the first time in years, dinner felt like a family gathering rather than a formal obligation. They laughed and told stories. The boys talked about their future plans. Evan said he wanted to be an architect like their mother. Ethan said he wanted to design video games. Neither career was possible without mathematics, and they all knew it. Rosa told the boys she was proud of them no matter what scores they received. They had already won by refusing to give up, by being willing to try new approaches, by believing in themselves again. The grades were just numbers on paper. The real victory was who they had become during this process. Marcus realized that Rosa understood something about fatherhood that he had forgotten. Success wasn't about achievements that looked good to the outside world. It was about growth, persistence, and character. The math exam took place on a cold December morning. Both boys walked into school with Rosa's words echoing in their minds. They sat at their desks, received their test booklets, and began working through the problems. Some questions were easy. Some were hard. Some required them to think carefully and use multiple steps, but nothing seemed impossible anymore. Ethan got stuck on a complex word problem about distances and speeds. He felt panic starting to rise, the old feeling of stupidity creeping back. Then he remembered what Rosa always said. Every problem is a story. What is this story really asking? He read it again slowly, drew a picture, and suddenly saw the answer. His pencil moved confidently across the page. Evan encountered a geometry question that would have destroyed him 6 months ago. It involved angles and triangles and multiple calculations, but Rosa had taught him to break complex problems into smaller steps. He didn't try to solve everything at once. He worked through it piece by piece, checking his work as he went. When he finished, he actually smiled. He had done it. 3 days later, the results came back. Marcus was at his office when his phone rang. It was Ethan calling from school, his voice shaking with excitement. He had passed the exam with a 78%, a C+, almost a B. It was the highest math grade he had ever received in his entire academic career. Before Marcus could respond, Evan grabbed the phone to share his own news. 82%. A solid B. He had not only passed but excelled. Marcus felt tears in his eyes, something that rarely happened to him. He told his sons he was proud of them, more proud than he had been of any business deal or acquisition. He left work early and drove straight home, stopping on the way to buy flowers for Rosa. When he arrived at the mansion, he found his sons in the kitchen with Rosa, celebrating with the cookies she had baked that morning. The boys rushed to hug their father, waving their test papers like victory flags. Marcus hugged them back, holding them longer than usual. Then he turned to Rosa and handed her the flowers. He told her that she had given his family something he couldn't buy with all his billions. She had given his sons their confidence and their future. She had taught them that they were capable of overcoming challenges. That was priceless. Rosa accepted the flowers with tears in her eyes. She said she was just doing what any good teacher would do, but Marcus shook his head. It wasn't just what she did. It was who she was. She had seen children in pain and refused to look away, even though it wasn't her job to help them. She had risked her position to do what she knew was right. That took courage and compassion that went far beyond teaching credentials. The headmaster called Marcus later that week to discuss the boy's remarkable improvement. He wanted to know what Marcus had done differently. Marcus told him the whole story, watching the headmaster's expression change from curiosity to disbelief to embarrassment. The school had recommended the most expensive interventions and never considered that what the boys needed was simply someone who understood how they learned. The headmaster asked if Rosa might be willing to work with other struggling students at the school. There were several children from wealthy families who were experiencing similar problems. They had been cycled through tutors and specialists without success. If Rosa's methods worked this well, the school would be interested in hiring her as an educational consultant. Marcus brought the offer to Rosa that evening. It would mean significantly more money and the recognition she deserved as an educator. She would have her own office at the school and work with multiple students. It was an opportunity to return to the career she loved. But Rosa surprised him by hesitating. She explained that she loved teaching, but she had grown to care deeply about the Wellington family. She didn't want to abandon the boys when they still needed her. She didn't want to stop being part of their daily lives. Money was important, but relationships mattered more. She had already lost so much when she left Guatemala. She didn't want to lose this new family she had found. Marcus was moved by her loyalty but insisted she shouldn't have to choose. They worked out an arrangement where Rosa would work 3 days a week at the school and continue tutoring Ethan and Evan the other days. She would still maintain her room at the mansion and be part of the household. It wasn't traditional, but nothing about their situation had been traditional from the beginning. Rosa began working at the private school after the winter break. The administrators gave her a small office and scheduled her to work with 5 struggling students. These were children from some of the wealthiest families in the city, kids who had been labeled with various learning disorders and deficits. Their parents had spent fortunes on evaluations and interventions. Some of the children were on medication. All of them believed they were broken. Rosa approached each student the way she had approached Ethan and Evan. She didn't start with textbooks or diagnostic tests. She started with conversations. She asked them about their interests, their hobbies, their dreams. She listened to how they spoke and watched how they moved. She looked for clues about how their minds processed information. Within a few weeks, she had developed individualized approaches for each child. A 10-year-old girl who loved dance learned fractions through choreography. A boy obsessed with dinosaurs mastered multiplication by calculating prehistoric timelines. A quiet student who seemed to have attention problems turned out to be a visual learner who needed to draw everything. Once Rosa gave her colored pencils and encouraged her to sketch the math problems, she excelled. None of these children were broken. They had just been taught in ways that didn't match how they naturally learned. Word spread quickly among the wealthy parents. By spring, Rosa had a waiting list of families desperate for her help. The school offered to expand her hours and increase her pay. Educational consultants from other institutions contacted her about her methods. A local news program wanted to do a story about the former housekeeper, who was revolutionizing how privileged children learned mathematics. Rosa found all the attention overwhelming. She had never sought fame or recognition. She had simply wanted to help children who reminded her of the students she had loved in Guatemala. But Marcus encouraged her to share her story. He pointed out that her example could inspire other immigrants who felt trapped in jobs that didn't use their full talents. She could show that education and intelligence weren't defined by where someone was born or what language they spoke at home. The news story aired on a Tuesday evening. It showed Rosa working with students, explaining her philosophy, and talking about her journey from Guatemala to America. The reporter interviewed Ethan and Evan, who spoke passionately about how Rosa had changed their lives. Marcus appeared briefly, admitting that he had been blind to the treasure living in his own home. He said the experience had taught him humility and opened his eyes to how society undervalued certain people. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Rosa received hundreds of messages from teachers, parents, and struggling students. Immigration advocates praised her story as an example of the contributions immigrants make to American society. Educational reformers pointed to her success as evidence that the traditional approach to teaching mathematics was failing many students. Publishers contacted her about writing a book explaining her methods, but the most meaningful response came from Rosa's family in Guatemala. Her elderly mother called crying with pride. Her nieces and nephews sent messages saying they had watched the interview online and were inspired by their aunt's success. Her former colleagues from her teaching days in Guatemala City reached out to congratulate her and thank her for representing their profession with such dignity. For Rosa, the attention was bittersweet. She was grateful for the recognition but worried about losing the simplicity she had found in her work with Ethan and Evan. Fame complicated things. She didn't want to become someone who gave lectures and wrote books. She wanted to sit with children and help them discover their own capabilities. That was where her heart lived. Marcus understood her concerns. He used his business connections to help Rosa maintain control over her career. He connected her with a lawyer who helped her trademark her teaching methods. He introduced her to a literary agent who could help her write a book on her own terms, focusing on the educational content rather than making her into a celebrity. He made sure she had the resources to say no to opportunities that didn't align with her values. As spring turned to summer, the Wellington household had transformed completely. Ethan and Evan finished the school year with their best grades ever. Ethan ended with a B- in mathematics and Evan achieved a straight B. More importantly, they had stopped seeing themselves as failures. They had learned that struggle didn't mean stupidity. Everyone learned differently, and finding the right approach was the key to success. The boys' relationship with their father had improved dramatically as well. Marcus had learned to be more present in their lives. He asked about their days and actually listened to the answers. He played video games with Ethan and looked at Evan's artwork. He had dinner at home most nights instead of working late. He realized that his sons didn't need him to be perfect or to provide them with endless, expensive things. They needed him to see them, to know them, to be genuinely interested in who they were becoming. Rosa continued splitting her time between the school and the Wellington home. She worked with struggling students 3 days a week and spent the rest of her time with Ethan and Evan. The arrangement worked beautifully. She maintained the close relationship with the boys while having the opportunity to help other children. The school gave her complete freedom to use her methods, and her success rate was remarkable. By the end of the school year, every student she worked with had improved by at least one letter grade. One evening in June, Marcus called a family meeting. Rosa wondered if something was wrong, but Marcus was smiling when they all gathered in the living room. He had an announcement to make. He had been thinking about his priorities and his legacy. Building a billion-dollar company was an achievement, but what did it matter if he had failed as a father? What did wealth mean if he couldn't recognize value when it was right in front of him? Marcus said he had decided to start a foundation dedicated to helping immigrant teachers get their credentials recognized in America. Too many qualified educators were working in jobs far beneath their capabilities because the system made it difficult for them to practice their profession. The foundation would provide support for certification processes, connect immigrant teachers with schools that needed them, and advocate for policy changes that would make the system more accessible. Rosa would help run the foundation if she was willing. She would identify talented teachers who needed support and help develop programs that honored different teaching approaches rather than forcing everyone into the same mold. It would be a way to multiply her impact beyond the students she could personally teach. She could help create a system where children like Ethan and Evan could find teachers who understood them before years of failure destroyed their confidence. Rosa was speechless. This was beyond anything she had imagined when she first sat down with the boys to help them with their homework. Marcus explained that she had already proven the concept with her success at the school. Immigrant teachers brought different perspectives and experiences that enriched education. They often understood struggle in ways that helped them reach struggling students. The foundation would help break down the barriers that kept these teachers from sharing their gifts. Ethan and Evan were excited about the foundation too. They wanted to help in whatever way they could. They suggested creating a student advisory board where kids who had been helped by great teachers could share their stories. They wanted other children to know that struggling in school didn't make them stupid. It meant they needed a different approach, and that approach existed if someone took the time to find it. Over the summer, Marcus worked with his lawyers to establish the foundation. He funded it generously but structured it to be sustainable beyond his initial investment. He recruited educators, immigration experts, and advocates to serve on the board. Rosa interviewed dozens of immigrant teachers, hearing stories that broke her heart and inspired her at the same time. There were engineers driving taxis, doctors working as nursing assistants, and teachers cleaning offices. All of them had valuable skills that society was wasting. The foundation launched in September with a small pilot program. They worked with 10 immigrant teachers in the local area, helping them navigate the certification process and connecting them with schools. 3 of them were from Guatemala like Rosa, 2 were from Nigeria. Others came from the Philippines, Syria, and Venezuela. Each brought unique perspectives and approaches to teaching. The schools that hired them reported immediate positive impacts. One of the teachers Rosa helped was a woman named Amara from Syria. She had been a physics professor before the war forced her family to flee. In America, she had been working as a hotel housekeeper while trying to figure out how to return to teaching. The foundation helped her get certified and connected her with a high school that desperately needed a physics teacher. Within months, she had transformed the struggling physics program. Students who had been failing were suddenly engaged and passing. It was Rosa's story all over again. By the end of the first year, the foundation had helped over 50 immigrant teachers return to the profession they loved. The success stories multiplied. Students who had been ready to drop out found teachers who understood them. Schools in underserved areas found qualified educators who were passionate about making a difference. The program proved so successful that other cities reached out asking how to replicate the model. For Rosa, the experience had come full circle. She had left Guatemala believing she was leaving teaching behind forever. She had accepted that her new life would be about cleaning homes and sending money to her family. But a simple act of compassion toward 2 struggling boys had opened doors she never imagined existed. She hadn't just helped Ethan and Evan. She had rediscovered her purpose and created a path for hundreds of other teachers to do the same. Ethan and Evan continued to thrive. They entered high school with solid academic records and genuine confidence in their abilities. They still worked with Rosa occasionally when they hit challenging material, but they had internalized her methods. They knew how to translate abstract concepts into terms they could understand. They knew how to ask for help without shame. They knew that struggling was part of learning, not a sign of failure. The boys never forgot what Rosa had taught them, and it extended far beyond mathematics. She had shown them that people's value wasn't determined by their job titles or their bank accounts. She had demonstrated that wisdom and capability could be found in unexpected places. She had taught them to look beyond surface appearances and recognize true quality in people. These lessons would serve them well throughout their lives. Marcus had learned even more profound lessons. His wealth and success had made him arrogant without realizing it. He had assumed that expensive automatically meant better, that prestigious credentials guaranteed competence, that people in service positions had nothing important to teach him. Rosa had shattered all those assumptions. She had humbled him and opened his eyes to how much he had been missing. The transformation in the Wellington household attracted attention from Marcus's business circle. Some of his colleagues thought he had gone soft, that his focus on education and immigrant rights was a distraction from building his empire. But Marcus didn't care anymore. He had enough money for 10 lifetimes. What he wanted now was meaning. He wanted to use his resources to solve real problems and help people who had been ignored by society. 3 years after Rosa first helped the boys with their homework, the foundation had expanded nationally. It had helped over 300 immigrant teachers return to classrooms. Educational researchers were studying the program's success and writing papers about its impact. Several states had changed their certification requirements to make them more accessible to foreign-trained teachers. The ripple effects kept spreading. Rosa published her book about teaching mathematics in the 4th year. It became a bestseller among educators and parents. She didn't present herself as having all the answers, but she offered a perspective that resonated with people who felt failed by traditional education. She emphasized relationship over curriculum, understanding over memorization, confidence over competition. Teachers from around the country adopted her methods and reported similar successes with struggling students. Despite all the success and recognition, Rosa remained grounded. She still lived at the Wellington mansion, though now she had a suite of rooms rather than just a small bedroom. She still had dinner with Marcus and the boys most evenings. She still celebrated their victories and supported them through their challenges. Fame hadn't changed who she was at her core. She was still a teacher who loved children and believed in their potential. Ethan and Evan graduated from high school with strong grades and college acceptances. Evan was accepted to architecture school, following in his late mother's footsteps. Ethan was admitted to a top program for game design and computer science. Both of them credited Rosa with making their futures possible. Without her intervention, they believed they would have been held back, placed in remedial programs, or convinced they were incapable of intellectual achievement. At their graduation party, Marcus gave a toast that brought everyone to tears. He talked about how close he had come to losing his sons, not to death or disaster, but to a system that couldn't see their potential. He thanked Rosa for her courage in speaking up when it wasn't her place, for caring about his children when she had every reason to stay silent, for showing his family what true education looked like. He said that meeting Rosa was the most important thing that had ever happened to him, more important than any business success. Rosa responded simply. She said she had just done what any teacher would do when they saw children suffering. But everyone in the room knew that wasn't true. Many people would have looked away, would have stayed in their lane, would have decided it wasn't their problem. Rosa had chosen to act, and that choice had changed multiple lives forever. She had proved that sometimes the most valuable people are those society overlooks, and that real wisdom has nothing to do with wealth or status.